Let me start off this conversation on new approaches to STI financing in Africa. If you were to be given 240 characters and told to say something about STI financing in Africa, what would it be? And obviously I'm referencing Twitter here. Mr. Faruqui?
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, Juliette, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be on the panel. I think that if you want to do research for development that actually has impact, you need to support African researchers that understand the context of the research that they're doing, build African institutions, and support gender transformative research. Hashtag SFSA.
Yes, hashtag. Professor Torto?
Hello. Yeah. I think for me, because of the fact that we are in a university campus, I probably would say that, so in education they talk about constructive alignment, and the construction is the students and the alignment is the syllabus. I'd want to see an alignment of funding with whatever is happening in the ground in terms of the governments. So whether it's the regional government, the community, the university, and every other stakeholder.
That's not a Twitter message, but I'll take it. Professor Fresco?
Well, it's perhaps good to tell you that we have been working in Africa for over 60 years, and we have several hundred research projects going on right today in Africa, 60 alone in Ethiopia. The success of that is based on the fact that we have an integrated approach. So we don't only seek funding, either from the EU, from our own government, or from philanthropic organizations. We also look at how we can align student education with that and how we can build upon projects so that we get generations of scientists trained in a holistic approach. And that would be my real recommendation. Do it in a synergistic way.
Professor Ameena, Gurib-Fakim.
Thank you again. If I were to talk about research, RTI, research technology innovation, if I were to tweet, I'll be tweeting in favor of the attention of African leaders and African policymakers, and I would say that RTI investment is an investment. It's not an expense.
It's an investment, it's not an expense. So, yeah, let's clap for her. That's a good one. Thank you. So it is well-known fact that effective research funding in STI by Africa, for Africa, and with the rest of the world is crucial for continuing evolution of STI on the continent. So, Professor Torto, maybe you could set the scene for us and tell us what the research funding landscape on the continent looks like at the moment.
Well, I think it would be, in order to be selfish and talk about how we do it at the African Academy of Sciences. I mean, at the African Academy of Sciences, as the President spoke earlier on, our mandate really focuses on three pillars. The first, recognition of excellence. The second is think tank-related activities, advising government. And the third is, programs. So in terms of programs, we've got a funding platform which we call IESA, the Alliance for Accelerating Excellence in Science in Africa. This platform, came to being because of our partnership with NEPAD, what the Commissioner said is the new AUDA. So with IESA, we have a platform that addresses various aspects. We are responsible for coming up with different programs that have got relevance in different sectors, that train different people. And also in the process, we also are looking at aspects of what is it really on the ground that makes other people, for instance, who, when we make a call for a particular grant, they're not able to respond in a manner that we expect. So we actually try to address critical gaps. And the second aspect to what we do is that we also want to try and find a platform that can also bring sustainability in terms of some of our programs, because we can't entirely depend on funding that is coming from outside. So we have a platform called CARI. CARI is an initiative that aims to really bring in African governments, bring in philanthropies, so that research which has to be conducted in the continent has to be driven by funding that is coming from within the continent.
Mr. Faruqui, when we talk about investment in STI, what are the key elements that we need to be thinking about?
Well, I guess to elaborate on what I said at the beginning, first, the importance of supporting local researchers and innovators. So someone mentioned the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences this morning, and IDRC is supporting them because these scholars do world-class modeling on things like Ebola. So rather than bringing an expert from the United States to model Ebola to stop its spread, you know, AIM scholars are doing that. Rather than bringing an expert to model the wave that occurs in a mine after you blast dynamite to save African lives, AIM scholars are doing that sort of thing. And another example of that sort of local innovators and researchers is women. So we're partnering with the World Academy of Sciences and with Swedish SIDA to help early career women scientists not just stay in the field, but excel in the field, because often women will get their PhDs, but then they're the ones who are asked to get coffee. They're the ones that are asked to write the research proposal and are not the head of the team. They're the ones that are 7th in the list of authors for a publication. So this program is about providing them mentoring, connecting them with networks, providing research funds, and placing them in labs in industry to build those connections. So I think that's one critical element.
Okay. And Professor Fresco, what are the 3 examples that you can give on North-South collaborations that provide opportunities, great opportunities to funding?
I think one of the most interesting things that's happening today is that I see the strong convening power of national organizations in Africa. Take the NRF, for example, here, partnering with organizations in Europe. And it's that combined power that both organizations ask for co-funding that has really helped us to mount programs that are far larger than smaller sort of ad hoc 3-year programs. And I'm very much in favor of long-term work, and that's what we see, for example, what we do here in South Africa now with the University of Pretoria and many other places. The alliance that is created with excellent universities in specific fields really makes that we can work in the longer term, and that means also that we can mobilize funds much better than before. Another example that I can give is the work we do in Ethiopia. There we have huge grants from the, for example, from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And that is particularly interesting because under that umbrella we have lots and lots of projects that all together make one program, and we can actually help these grantees to formulate projects, which would be difficult, as we saw in the last session, sometimes to formulate, and by helping professionally to formulate good projects, we really make a step ahead. And the interesting thing of philanthropic organizations, I think, is that they are willing, and I push them to that, to do the risk-taking research. So research where you sometimes don't know whether innovations will come or where you push the boundaries and the frontiers of science. And I think those are the kinds of things that we need to pursue. I think lastly, also, we need to, and that's more a desire than that we have it completely organized, but under the next European framework programs, we will be able to do far more with nutrition, nutritional quality, food safety, and so on. And by this obligation to co-funding, you actually get governments interested as well, or they're obliged to be interested, and that means you can also link it to government policy. And in the area of food safety, for example, that's absolutely essential. So you reach out to the standard setting as well as to the underlying research.
Okay, and I like the fact that you mentioned government funding and the philanthropists. Perhaps I'd ask Professor Ameena Gurib-Fakim, not to be controversial, but yes, to be controversial. If I had a funding pyramid, and at the funding pyramid, and at the very top, you know, you have the 4 criteria. You have funders such as government, the private sector, philanthropists, and funding agencies. How would you rank them?
I'll just respond quickly to what has been said just now. If you look at the history of sub-Saharan Africa, and most of them are around 50 years, And we find that the research has been funded a lot by donors. There has been donor funding. Thank goodness there has been. But I still consider this donor funding to be seed money. And where we fail, if I say fail, is that there has not been the 1% or whatever percentage in terms of supporting this funding which has initially come from the donors. Now, if you look at research within the framework of the SDGs, the 17 SDGs, we find that for the first time in UN history, they have recognized science as being central to making changes, in terms of livelihoods of people. So if we are going to leave no one behind, if we are going to deliver by 2030, we will need to have governments being more and more committed to the research agendas for their countries. Now, why it's important, to improve livelihoods, but interestingly, I've just listened to some of the presentation just now in terms of generating this new oil, which is now data. To be able to really shape the policy on the continent, we will need to develop Africa-centric policies. And these Africa-centric policies can only come when research, blue-sky research, data, and PhD, and whatever it is, research is happening in African institutions. So if I were to rank, as you have said, I would say I would go to my government and I would say, look, how are you committed? Walk the talk in terms of putting money where the mouth is. And also the other narrative that increasingly we need to have is the link with the private sector. How is government linking to the private sector so that these ideas which are generated in universities or research centers are translated, they cross the valley of death and they actually generate data, research, whatever it is, to improve livelihoods of people. It would be unfair to say that research isn't happening in Africa. There's a lot of research happening, but it is not protected. The IP framework is very weak, so it is not generating wealth as it would have been. And to be able to generate wealth from research, we also need the contribution of philanthropists. So all these factors, all these actors must work together in synergies, but the first point of call of any researcher must be to go to their government to make them commit to what they've said.
So I can see Nelson would like to contribute on that, and maybe as you're contributing, you could, one of the narratives that is always put out there is that African governments do not have money. You know, there's never enough money. Maybe that's why we've never been able to meet the 1% that was set, you know?
No, for me, I think, I've said it to many people that there is no African government without money. I don't believe that. There is no African government without money. African governments have got money. But I think the issue is there's a way in which, for instance, if a funder is coming to country X, they are coming into country X, them having gone through their strategy in terms of how they want to fund for the number of years they want to fund. So when they come into country X, the assumption is that by virtue of coming for a meeting and say, you know what, we want to fund in this area, the assumption is that the government that they are talking to should on that particular day, week, say, you know what, this is what we want to do. But we know that the African governments also have got their own structures. They have to go through processes where they have to rationalize and say, can this money be used for this? Can it not be used for that? That will take maybe a year or 2 years. But of course, that is too long a time for a funder who has got money who wants to spend the money on something else. So for that reason, I feel, I've said it to colleagues that we don't want a situation where you go into a country and you are the one who is driving what has to be done. What you want is that you want to partner with the governments so that the governments, in your absence, can actually go to the people and say, you know what, whether they say we, the government, and partner X are doing this, or whether they say we are doing this, but you want the government to be the one that drives it. But as long as we negate the thought of that particular government, we are bound to say that they're not interested. But obviously, we know the African governments have put up infrastructures. They've done a lot of things that clearly are in their own plans. So the issue is, can we get alignment, like I said before? Can we get alignment in terms of what is on the ground and the money that is coming in?
I'll just quickly react to this. If you look at a country like India, just came out of independence in the 40s, and we had a leader in the name of Pandit Nehru. Now, if we look at the vision, the policy, the vision he had in 1958, this is the vision that has shaped the way India is now. So there needs to be a vision. What was his vision? Is that India at that time was a poor country, but even if it was a poor country, they never compromised on the budget which was given to develop the human capital. And we see at the time that in terms of investment, they no longer depended on heavy infrastructure for development, and they needed the gray matter. India has made massive progress, and of course, about 47% of Silicon Valley, they have researchers coming from the Indian subcontinent. Now, what I have said, and I will say it again, I'll be repetitive. Africa's future is in the mines. It is not in the mines. So this is something that I keep saying all the time. We are talking about the youth dividend in Africa. This youth dividend can easily become a youth bane if we don't channel the energy. And channel the energy because it's a very young continent. By 2035, this continent will be providing the workforce for most parts of the world. So we need to shape that youth. We need to shape that energy. And the only way to do this is to invest in the long-term future of the youth of our continent. And this will be done through quality education. Education that will be able to prepare the same youth for jobs that don't exist now. And we've seen artificial intelligence, we've seen big data, we've seen all these, but this will only be done if we start making our kids thinking laterally. Thank you.
So you brought up an issue on demographic dividend that I was going to go into and invite Professor Fresco to talk about. But I just want to go quickly back to what Nelson was talking about and invite Mr. Faruqui. You know, so India is a very good example, and closer home is South Africa, where we are at. Initially I said, you know, I like how things are done down south. There's a really good example of, I think, a partnership between an African government, this is Ministry of Science and Technology, the NRF, National Research Fund, IDRC, and also DFID to come up with something called the Science Granting Council Initiative. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that partnership and what that looks like?
Thanks, Juliette. And I think it really complements what Nelson was talking about in terms of alignment and also the issue of African governments investing. And I think that in the past, donors have, to a certain extent, circumvented the science infrastructure in countries in which they're funding research. And I would say that even IDRC, when we first started, we focused on individual researchers. But this initiative, which we're doing in partnership with the National Research Foundation, with DFID and CEDA, as you mentioned, is building the capacity of science granting councils, 15 science granting councils across the continent to better manage research, to transfer knowledge to the private sector, to learn from each other. What we're seeing is co-investment, and we're seeing alignment. Because what we don't want to do is sort of come in and set what the research priorities should be. Those research priorities should be coming from the countries themselves. They should be determining what those priorities are. And I'm glad that a lot of the heads of the councils and other key players within councils are here at this forum, and looking forward to having them also present on panels and so forth. But some of them have been telling me that the investments that have come from outside have helped them leverage additional funds from their governments. And I think is also helping us link up some initiatives. So I'm delighted that we asked Nelson to be one of our advisors for the Science Granting Council initiative, because you know what is happening with IASA and other initiatives is complementary to the Science Granting Initiative. And that's important from the viewpoint of alignment and joining up efforts. Now this has triggered something else that the Minister of Science and Technology announced just yesterday, and that's the Tambo Research Chairs. IDRC and NRF have experimented with what we call trilateral chairs. So these were chairs in Canada, South Africa, and in other African countries. But we're co-investing in something now building on the legacy of O.R. Tambo, to support chairs outside of South Africa. And I really do want to applaud the government of South Africa of taking this step to invest in science outside of South Africa. And we're connecting it to the Science Granting Council initiative. So again, it's not this sort of isolated thing. The chairs will be the countries that have science granting councils that are part of the initiative will have the right to apply for these chairs as long as they co-invest as well. So it's another example of building partnerships so that you get alignment and co-investment.
Okay. Professor Fresco?
Well, I think what is important is that we do things at different levels. So it's essential that governments have a science policy, of course, and that they also define what the objectives are of innovation, because science and innovation are not the same thing. Secondly, I see Africa working best when there is an open exchange. Then there is a transparency in who works on what subject, how can we find the synergies. And a lot can be gained by having exchanges of students, of staff, through different African universities, and also, for example, to us, since we are so much focused on Africa. And I think that individual initiative at the grassroots of the scientists is also very important. And we shouldn't structure everything from above, because some of the good ideas are what we call curiosity-driven science and innovation, and we should foster that. But to cater to your point about the youth, one of our most valuable experiences is to give young students a chance to already develop innovation. We call that Start Life or Start Hub, where we actually use alumni and staff to tease out nice ideas that students have that may have a commercial value, and let them experiment with that in a kind of living lab on campus, and then go out to Africa. We have something called Sandwich PhD also, where people do some coursework with us, do their research in Africa, come back and finalize the PhDs, and then see whether there is a kind of innovation that can grow out of that. And it's this coupling of science with practical innovation and nurturing that with young people that I think is going to really change the landscape. And that is, of course, all in a context that's defined by governance, by donors, and so on. But it's this grassroots movement, getting even kids at school interested in science as a career is going to be really important. It's also about who are the next generation scientists to really make the changes.
So just because I see comments?
No, I just wanted to say that I think I wanted to extend one of my points that, the issue of, having things known on the ground, in the sense that, if you look at African governments, so at independence, African governments have been able to come with NDPs, the National Development Plans. In the past few years, or 5, 7, 8 years, they've come up with Vision X, Vision Y, that sort of thing. Every country has got a vision something, Vision 2020, Vision 2016. But I think one wants to see countries coming up with a systematic approach of understanding what is on the ground by doing something like a foresight analysis, where clearly a country would now be able to link things together. I think one of the things that the President was talking about earlier on was the issue of passports. That, at a continental level, we want to collaborate, we want to work together, but we cannot move, amongst the different countries. So it means that we haven't addressed the issue on the ground. So I feel that also, if there was a foresight analysis, there can be connectivity in terms of what the country is doing. So even if something was going to come, whether it's blue sky or whatever the case, we would know that we have got a particular syllabus at primary school, we've got a certain infrastructure somewhere else, so that things start to connect. Typically, if I look at, let's say, the cluster system that maybe like Denmark is using, the cluster system is quite clear in the sense that you see the role of the university, you see the role of the local government, you see the role of everyone else who is within that space. So that when you want to innovate in a certain area, you clearly know that if you are in Pretoria, you should be accountable to what Pretoria is trying to drive in terms of your activities. So everyone is working towards that. So it means that you can generate knowledge, in a specific zone, and therefore you can be able to innovate in that sense.
Just while we're on the issue of innovation, and you know, Professor Gurib-Fakim, you mentioned IP. So, I mean, when it comes to IP, you have an innovator and they have a good idea. So we want to move from ideation to activation to business incubation, and then hopefully a viable company that's profitable. I mean, what are the situations that we need? I mean, Alia was talking to you about what are the key elements to investing in STI. When it comes to IP, what are the environments we need to be thinking about that we need to facilitate through investment to create that enabling environment such that an innovator has enough finances to be able to think and then to be able to transition all the way to scale?
Yeah. There is something else that just quickly look at the bills. When we actually look at annual bills for countries in Africa, how much we pay out for IP and how much we earn in terms of IP generation. I'll just take one small example. Kenya, where you're from, we talk about a great deal about mobile money. M-Pesa is great, it's making a wonderful impact on livelihoods of people with mobile money. But let us find out where it's registered, the IP. It's not in Kenya. Okay? So how much is being lost out in terms... Now, there is always this dialogue that many African countries buy into this dialogue that we can buy the technology, we can adapt it in a country. Fine. There are certain things where we'll need to do that. But maybe even in the adaptation of that technology, it may be more onerous than actually developing homegrown. Now, when you develop it, when you actually produce that, you need to have the landscape, you need to have the proper policy, the framework to protect that IP and to make it work. And this is again where we're weak on the continent. We haven't really focused on this. People have said, yes, we need to research for impact. That's fine, we can still do that. But in terms of generation of wealth, in terms of job creation, in terms of everything that we talk about innovation, the overarching term, we need to be able to protect that IP to make it work for the continent. And again, this is where we haven't done enough in terms of that protection. Now, there is, we're talking about some of the stagnant technologies on the continent. We see so many of these that, you know, are not protected. Now, where does it start? Where can we make a difference? In South Africa, I know most universities have an IP office. So the PhD work goes to this IP office. They see whether there's anything that is protected. And if it is protected, the PhD will be embargoed until, of course, the right patent or whatever is actually been registered. But I don't see this happening in many African universities. So everybody's out there with the idea of publish or perish, because this is the finality of an academic. So a lot of this precious information is being lost. So again, we need to have a rehaul of the whole thing, and I think I'm very happy that one of the speakers have mentioned that AU also needs to look at data. Data is the new oil. We generate lots of it, but how much of it is going to work for the continent? This is something that we need to ask ourselves. So this goes in line with innovative approaches to all this, which is of course new in the next few years to come.
Can I add something on the IP issue? Because that's indeed a very important issue. And there are two dimensions here. One is that scientists and students need to become more IP aware, or put differently, broader, aware of the fact that they may be creating value in what they do. That value may be social value, it's not always IP. But we have in fact been very cautious in taking out IP, because to protect IP, as you know, you have to protect it in every single country. That's an extremely expensive process. And we actually tend now to take out less and less intellectual property rights, or fewer, and we tend to use that as a kind of negotiation instrument with people, particularly also the private sector we are working with. So we don't take it out, but it's our tool to attract attention in a pre-competitive phase with the private sector. And actually that gives us funding, which we can then match with public funds in private-public partnerships, and makes us actually stronger than if we had the IP ourselves. So my only advice here would be just look at the IP very carefully, where it's really worthwhile protecting it and making the costs, and see where you can use it in a different way, still having an IP, but not necessarily incurring all the costs.
You know, my views about IP are very controversial. You know, when I used to work in Botswana work for government, I used to tell my minister that never show that slide that compares, you know, Botswana with other countries in terms of patents and everything. Because my philosophy has always been that, a patent is not money in the bank. You know, it can be one of your biggest blunders as a CEO to promote someone on the basis of a registered patent, because if it doesn't come to anything, you look silly after a couple of years. So I've got a couple of patents myself, but I still work for the African Academy of Sciences. You know, one of my last years as a professor at the university, I think we had about 3 or 4 patents that we were going to register when I was at Rhodes. We did the initial round of 20,000 rands. And obviously, when you want to do a PCT patent, you are looking at 100,000 rands for each. So, you know, and if there's no possibility that you can actually be able to generate something from the patent, then it becomes a bit dicey for whoever is funding. So clearly, I think it's an issue of a case-by-case where you rationalize and try to see, can you really be able to generate value from this? And if you can't, what is the best possible way of doing it? Because, I mean, the other thing is that when you actually issue out a patent, you are exposing yourself, whatever the case. Because you have to disclose everything. People will be able to see what the composition of the patent is. And that's why Coke does not have a patent. That's why Kentucky is so good, but there's no patent. Simply, if they were to tell people the ingredients, they will find a way of circumventing how they can actually be able to do that. So, for me, it's a tricky one.
But is there a trademark to Kentucky?
Naser is correct. Yeah, it's on a case-by-case basis. It all depends. But having said this, there's also an initiative at country level, because countries need to sign up to the PCT agreement so that you bring down the cost in terms of looking at old patent. So this is where, again, governments have to be involved. Governments have to lay out the policy. And again, this is, I feel, a major weakness now in our institutions, where we don't see this commitment from government in terms of addressing these needs. Now, if you look at patent, I mean, patent need not be the hard and fast. I'm just looking at protection of intellectual property in the widest sense of the word. Let us take an area where we are familiar with on the African continent. How many traditional knowledge has been lost out because they haven't been protected? What did India do? What did China do? China was awarded a Nobel in 2015 for one product which is helping to cure malaria, and it comes from traditional knowledge, which has been documented in traditional Chinese medicine. How much documentation is happening on our continent? Well, I can tell you the short answer, not much. So when are we going to take that seriously? And now there's trademark, there's all sorts of things. We have seen recently, for example, the kikoi leaving Kenya. I mean, there's so many issues like this which need to be tackled. But this comes with the intangible knowledge and the intangible asset of a country that the country needs to take seriously. And it can only be taken seriously when government puts emphasis on that protection.
It's that, but it's also sharing resources. For example, you're absolutely right on describing the plant resources, traditional and indigenous wild plants. There is an enormous lack there. Now, we did a whole inventory of plant resources for Africa, and we tried to actually give it free of charge to countries, but it meant they had to open up a database. And when we did that a couple of years ago, no country was actually interested in developing the database. So if we had done that probably collectively, or we had organized that in a better way, I'm sure it could have been taken up. So it's also very important that not every country reinvents the wheel, because sometimes the burden of doing that is too great for one single small country. So you want to really promote also that collaborative transboundary inter-African effort, certainly on things like databases on, in this case, wild plants, for example.
Technology is now helping, and there's one project which I'm initiating, is the protection of traditional knowledge using blockchain technologies. And with this development, you can protect, because, you know, it's easy now just to take, with synthetic biology, you can take out that gene actually generating the active material and just patent it elsewhere. So again, it's lost for the content. So with this blockchain technology, you can put the entire profile of the plant, you can protect that. So the technology is available. It's a matter of adapting it to that particular, to that particular initiative. But again, how do we actually move ahead? What finances be put at disposal? That's again another dialogue we need to have, and this is where philanthropists come in. And I think we are having this discussion with Nelson of how we can generate Afro champions to promote this kind of drive, and that's also on the card. So we're working on that.
So I'll come back to the Afro champions comment. Mr. Faruqui, you want to add something?
I actually want to talk about research excellence, but I'll make a couple of comments on the area of IP and commercialization. And I don't disagree with anything anybody said. I think it's actually quite a complicated issue, and we could have an entire panel on it. I think that certainly appropriate intellectual property protection that's modernized is important. A lot of the granting councils actually have been saying to us that they, through the Science Granting Council initiative, that they want owners to help them go to the sharper end of innovation and not just talk about research, but talk about commercialization and support them in that area as well. And I think that the idea of technology transfer offices and commercialization offices in universities is one thing that, in South Africa, I think there's many universities that do that very well, but in other parts of Africa, there's still room to grow in that area. But I actually want to bring it back just to the issue of financing and what you finance. I really liked the keynote address on artificial intelligence earlier today. IDRC just released a white paper on artificial intelligence for development, and we're going to be starting a new program on that, building capacity to do artificial intelligence. And we're starting in sub-Saharan Africa to change the channel from Africans of being sort of receivers of technology to being producers of artificial intelligence and other sophisticated technologies like blockchain. And we really believe that there is this capacity in Africa and this potential for in Africa. I was recently, just last week, at a big AI conference in Canada that came out of the G7, and there was no diversity there. Most of the people there were middle-aged white men, frankly, and there were so few people of color or women. And I think that diversity in terms of the type of people who are involved, but also the countries and the continents that are involved, is very, very important. And if we really want to see commercialization, we're going to have to support not just research, but innovation in Africa. I think that's critical.
So that's an interesting point, actually, about diversity, because I wanted us to talk a little bit about women and investing in women in science. And then I want to also tie it perhaps maybe with the private sector. So higher institution, the funding from the Wageningen University. How have you been able to attract, maintain the private sector in terms of getting the finances from them and then just keep going in partnership all the way till the end? How have you been able to attract them, basically?
Attracting the private sector is a matter of long-term trust building and building a common language. That doesn't happen overnight. And the mistakes I've seen made, also in my own institution, but also elsewhere and here in Africa, is that people consider the private sector as a bag of money. That's not how the private sector wants to operate. So for us, what has worked best, and we currently have on our campus or in a very short radius around the campus, we have 170 companies that work with us. What works best is not to work so much with individual companies, but with groups of companies. And sometimes we help them. The greatest need for innovation is in the small and medium enterprises. It's not the big companies, it's the small and medium enterprises that create also employment. They often don't have funds for research. But what we have introduced is a voucher system. So small companies actually can buy like a subscription to our research, an annual subscription. They get vouchers through which we can answer certain questions for them. And they can do that collectively, so we also help them to organize themselves to formulate those questions in a way that scientists can work with us. We do this in horticulture, we do this in fisheries, and it's really quite a successful means to mobilize the SMEs and help them to take a next technological step. With the larger companies, we build this long-term trust. We do only pre-competitive work so that it's not stuff that goes to the market, and the larger companies are interested in us not to solve their marketing problems. That's far too close to the market, but they want to know from us what are the frontiers of science. So what, for example, is the latest thinking on nutrition? What happens in the human gut? What do we know about the human gut, and how can that perhaps be translated in food companies? And it's building that long-term relationship and showing that you're a real partner in a dialogue, that you understand the language and that you're honest. And we have very strict rules and regulations about keeping our independence. And we always want to publish. So you can hold on to something for a little while, but every single PhD thesis that is funded with private sector money will always be published. And the best combinations are private-public partnerships on long-term issues where we have generations of scientists and students working together in the long term. And this works very well now with the European Union that is interested also to combine efforts with African universities and ourselves to really work in this long-term approach. And I think that combination, the SMEs, the long-term relationship with the big companies, and the physical presence on our campus. We have 115 nationalities on campus, so it's a real talent pool. People can meet, people can discuss things. I think that combination is perfect, but it has taken us decades to build this. This is not something that happens overnight.
On the issue of diversity?
Yeah, I'll just quickly react to one word you have said earlier on, the word diversity. Now it's more or less a given. I hope it is the case with donors and with institutions that we need diversity, we need to bring more women on board. I'm just going away from what have been discussed. But I just wanted to bring that notion of diversity, and I will also bring it to the issue of linking up. H3 Africa is being driven out of the AISA. But I don't think that people know how much genetics matter in testing of drugs. This is where I also bring in the notion of diversity. We have found that, for example, coming back again to big companies, products coming out of big companies have failed the African continent because we haven't taken on board the diversity, the genetics of the peoples. So this is something that we need to bring on board all the time. This is why, again, we need to tropicalize a lot of the research going on because we need to bring into factor in this component of diversity. But I just wanted to say something else. Because we're talking about diversity, we are talking about H3 Africa. We are talking about how important the genes matter for testing, for developing optimal drugs, doses, for example. But this is, again, speaks to government, it speaks to institutions, it speaks to organizations like the Academy of Sciences. How are we positioning ourselves in terms of papers? A position paper of a particular issue on the continent of a country. This is something we need to have. Preparedness. How prepared are we in terms of going around for negotiation? That's one thing. The other thing, how do we communicate on this? How good are we at communicating? How do we demystify the complicated language of science that policymakers and the common people understand? So this is, again, something that we need to be addressing at the level of all our institutions. I'm taking away from the main conversation here, but I thought I'll bring in this notion of diversity, I'll bring in this notion of communication, because this is, again, something that fails us at the level of our functioning institutions.
Well, I don't think you're actually taking us away, because when you talk about communication, Professor Fresco was earlier saying, you know, when you think about investing at a higher education where you're providing training, and she mentioned when it comes to IP, you also train the researchers to start thinking about it from the very start. It's the same, I think, it's applicable with science communication, to train scientists or researchers to think about how will they communicate their work above and beyond just publishing in a reputable journal. You know, it's never enough. Earlier on, we heard from one of our speakers that you need to be able to engage the public, policymakers. At some point, your research is going to inform policy making. I think that's an important aspect. One thing I wanted to speak to, Nelson to speak to, is the AISA platform, and back to the conversation about diversity and women. You provide funding across the continent. What are you doing in terms of identifying women who you could provide the funding to? What's the unique thing that AISA, Kari is going to do, and AISA is doing at the moment?
Listen, I think one of the things that is unique about the AISA platform is the fact that we want to ensure that research questions are formulated within the context of the continent and within the context of the country in which the person is. That is very, very important. And the second thing also is the excellence associated with that research. So I think we are not trying to fund research because we just have to fund it. And as I said earlier on, I think we fund it on a criteria of excellence. And as far as we are concerned, we are quite clear in terms of what are the requirements for whoever can actually be able to get funding from us. We want to see an equitable situation in terms of the number of females that can actually be brought into, whether they are being trained or whether it's partnership amongst the different researchers. So that is quite clear. So for most of our programs, I think experience is that we have been able to see funding of either PhD or MSc students almost at a 50-50% distribution in terms of male and female.
Is it something that you're doing, or is it just a national?
It's something that we are doing, and it's something that we insist on. So clearly, whoever applies for funding from us knows that the issue of gender has to be addressed. I mean, gender is very, very important. Of course, we are a Pan-African organization. You have to look at the countries to start with and see what is the coverage. I mean, we are operating in at least 46 African countries at the moment. And in those 46 African countries, we want to ensure that, obviously, we want to ensure that we cover the whole of Africa, but at the same time, in that process, we want to make sure that we're actually driving excellent research where even if we insist on gender parity, the issue of excellence should not be ignored, so to speak. But I think one of the things that I said earlier on was that I think one thing that is unique about the African Academy of Sciences is that we are not just giving out funds and then saying, you know what, these are the people who got funding and that's it. We are clearly interested in addressing what are the gaps, what are the gaps, what are the gaps in Mozambique? Why is it that we are not getting as many female applicants from Mozambique as we are getting maybe from Nigeria or from South Africa? What is it that we should put in place so that we can close the gap? I think clearly what one doesn't want to see is that we don't want to see the same gap between Africa and Europe or Africa and North America being generated within the continent. Clearly, obviously, there are some countries that have advanced in terms of infrastructure investment and so forth and so forth. They're bound to come up tops. But we are trying to come up with different models that can allow us to twin those who don't have the capacity with those who have the capacity. On one hand, sometimes you might want to put the burden of proof on the institution, and on the other, you want to put it on the individual. But if the individual doesn't have the right infrastructure, you want to make sure that they are able to access institutions that can allow them to do the work that they're supposed to do. But I think as a priority, I think we ensure that whoever has to have access to our funding has to look into the issue of gender, and I think it's very, very important. But also I think we don't want this situation where you are bringing women for the sake of. I think the quality issue also is very important because everyone deserves to be recognized for what they can do. But if there are limitations, let's try and see how we can address the limitations.
I like that you've mentioned infrastructure.
Just one thing quickly, Juliette, is that it is very easy to fall into the trap of saying we can't bring in women because we can't find good women. I mean, I've heard this before. I'm sorry, I don't buy this. We need to develop policies like the Swedes, for example, in CEDA, where they impose a percentage of women contribution at all levels of the project. And that would be the only way that we will be taking that woman up. Because it would be very easy to fall into the trap and say, we can bring women we could not bring because we couldn't find. There are plenty of women out there, but we need to be much more proactive and have these affirmative actions to make them on board.
Mr. Faruqui?
Yeah, thanks, Juliette. I just wanted to pick up on the important points about research quality and research excellence in which gender comes into play. So IDRC recently came up with a framework for what we call Research Quality Plus. That's about research for development. And it has 4 parameters. So some of the things that we've talked about already are there. So positioning for use to ensure that the research can actually be taken up by policymakers. The importance of the research, is it innovative? Is it adding something to local or global debates? Naturally, scientific rigor. So, you know, is it methodologically sound, high quality? Will it be published in peer-reviewed journals and so forth? But the really important and I think novel aspect is what we call research legitimacy. And what that is the degree to which local knowledge, traditional knowledge, is taken into account, the degree to which it responds to gender issues, hopefully being gender responsive and ambitiously actually being gender transformative in terms of changing norms and policies and laws, and you know, addressing power asymmetries. And so we developed this framework, and in our last round of very large external reviews for IDRC programming, including one of my programs, 7 external reviews that were independently done, we looked at 170 projects. And then we put those all together in a mega database. And the findings were frankly startling and quite instructive, I think, to our discussion today. So one of the key findings was that there's no contradiction between research that is intended to be capacity building and the quality of that research. There was no trade-off. And our hypothesis is that the degree of effort put to mentorship means that the quality comes up. A second really important dimension was that young researchers innovate, which is not surprising, but is instructive in terms of supporting more early career scientists to do research. But the researchers that innovate the most are local researchers, presumably because they understand the context the best. And the third finding that I wanted to highlight was that Southern-led research was the highest quality research that IDRC supported. Now that is our mandate, but we've also supported North-South research, and we occasionally support research that's done by Canadians on international issues, like many countries do. But we're sort of a scientific council for the developing world, so that's the exception, not the rule. And that was really, really critical finding for us, because what it means is that you can still do North-South research, but you shouldn't do it because you're expecting that means that the quality of the research is going to be higher. Southern-led research is the highest quality research, and I think that that's quite important for donors that are funding in Africa or elsewhere, is not to tie it to their domestic researchers, but to support Africans.
Professor Fresco?
Perhaps slightly on a tangent, apart from the gender diversity, there's also something like the diversity of experience. And we feel very strongly that some real gains are to be made by allowing people to function in different types of environments and to expose them also to different cultural environments. And one of the things we have developed, I think, quite strongly is what we call the international classroom, where nationalities as far apart from Chile to China, from Zimbabwe to Russia, all sit together and explore problems together. And it's honing those skills of being able to communicate with people from different backgrounds, or not from your nationality, not your culture, not even maybe your language, but you share a scientific interest with them. That's very important for the development of the individual. And I would like to say here that we are very keen to extend our hospitality to students and staff from Africa to join us for periods longer or shorter to get that exposure, because it's very important. I learned so much when I was, as a young student, went to Africa, and in the course of my career went and lived in Africa many, many times. And I think having that exposure to young scientists from Africa or young students is going to enrich them as human beings and as scientists, and gives them a sense of innovation that they may not always get at home. So it's the richness of the diversity in the widest possible sense.
So I think we've started the critical thinking about the areas of investment in STI, and I'm aware that we are stopping people from having a drink in hand. So just to start concluding, I want you to tie it down back to the theme of this particular meeting, igniting conversations about science. I want you to tell me maybe 3 points, short, quick points, or what you want people to start talking about more on investing in STI, and what you want people to do less of in terms of conversations around investment in STI.
I can see that I'm your first victim. I mean, for me, I think it's just one thing that I should say 3 times. I think we need to find a way of engaging African governments so that they can actually be the drivers of this process. For me, I think that is the most important thing.
So that's the only thing. You'd repeat
3
it
times,
3
but
times.
once. Yeah, 3
Okay.
times.
Thanks, Nelson. Prof?
I'll just quickly react on what has been said. You mentioned diversity. You just pick up your point in terms of mixing people from different regions. I think it's also time now to really start thinking, because increasingly we say we need to have people doing STEM. I think we need to talk about STEAMed. We need to put the art, we need to put the design. We really need to look at diversity within the realm of the interface between disciplines. This is something that increasingly we have seen in the 20th century. For example, physics has been the major, physics and chemistry, the interface have given rise to so many new developments. But right now we are seeing more and more in terms of the biology interface. So we really need to look at how to mainstream this in the conversation. So increasingly, if you want to look at funding, looking at funding at the interface of the disciplines, so that we can see more and more innovation coming out in these, and also bring in the art, bring in the design, bring in so that we can see much more flourish in terms of innovation. Now again, to come back to things that we should not do, I'll just quickly, because this is something very close to my heart, because I have been a victim of this as well, is that we need to keep on removing stereotypes so that this girl child can develop to her full potential. Thank you.
And your 3 things that people need to be talking more of, and 3 things that they need to be talking less of.
I think getting governments, and hence having scientists to speak up to governments to really have a policy on the relevance of science, including investment in science, is going to be very important. So that's not a responsibility of a Ministry of Science and Education. It's a Ministry of Finance that should be involved, very much so. And it should be a broadly cabinet-based priority setting of the big areas where science funding should make a difference to the country. So those are big priorities. One of the things that is often missing, and that would be my plea, is to do that in dialogue with society. So indeed with motivating young people, but also to make sure that science does not get isolated. You need a little bit of isolation sometimes because you need to think, and certain things are not immediately clear in their relevance, and they may be very clear later on. But you need to give the support of society for investing in science, and not, for example, in health. It's public money. These are choices that need to be made. And governance must have a very good narrative, a very good story, where investing in science is investing in the future. And I think we should engage also as scientists far more in that dialogue with society, asking also, what are the questions that you feel need to be responded to? What are the big issues in your mind with respect to the future? future? And how can science be a part of the answers? It can't be all the answers. But that kind of dialogue should go hand in hand with government priority setting.
Mr. Faruqui?
It's hard to think of just three things, but I think I'm going to come back to the issue of gender transformative research. So that's one thing I want to leave with the audience. IDRC has been trying to up our game in terms of our overall portfolio, having a little bit more research that's actually gender transformative during the life of the research project itself. So we've been thinking about this a lot lately, and that is one of the considerations for research that's truly changing norms and laws and policies, is one, looking at root causes of power asymmetries and so forth, and then doing action research. So I'll give you one example. We have a project called HarassMap that uses Ushahidi, a software that was developed in Kenya, actually, to map sexual harassment against women. We started this project in Egypt. It's cool in the sense that it's using crowdsourcing to collect data on a sensitive issue that women don't necessarily want to talk about, so you get a better understanding of the issue. But it's also transformative in the sense that you know, the guys that are hanging around the kiosk at the local shop harassing the women that are walking by, when you go to them and say, you know, what about gender, what about sexual harassment, they say, oh, it doesn't happen. And then you say, well, it happened last week, here, here, and here, and here's the data. And then you get them to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. You get the shopkeepers to put a sign up that says this is a harassment-free zone. You get Cairo University to be the first university to have an anti-sexual harassment policy in Egypt. And that, to me, in terms of having the world be a little bit of a better place through research, is absolutely critical. So I think that collectively we need to support more gender transformative research, because it's going to improve lives for women and men.
So what do you want to leave the audience with? Just a quick statement, a quick punchline. What's your call to action? I'll start from you.
Well, I'll just repeat what I said at the beginning. I think supporting local researchers, African researchers, is absolutely critical. Building and strengthening African institutions, so you're strengthening the overall science system, not just one part of it, and building linkages through it, and supporting gender transformative research. That will help the research for development to actually have an impact.
Great.
Yeah, I think for me it's what I said at the beginning. I think I would like to see some alignment. I think alignment is very critical, and that should come out of, you know, every respective country government having understood its own situation on the ground, so that when someone comes in and they want to fund, I mean, people should be clearly aware, like what Ameena was saying. I mean, people should be clearly aware of what is it that has to be done on the ground. I know that sometimes, you know, governments would say that, you know, we want to do research in water, we want to do research in this area, but it's not clearly articulated. So I remember when I was a CEO, I mean, the research institute I was running was doing water according to my interests. There was no one who could say, you know what, Nelson, you should go in this direction. So I think for when we don't have a lot of resources, I think it's quite good to be able to define the space in which people can operate, so that we can know that the little investment that can come in is going to head us in a certain direction, and we are going in that direction. I think for me that is quite crucial. So alignment is very important.
Thank you. Professor Fresco?
Yeah, maybe as a variation on what you just say, I would look for synergies thematically. So what are the big priority areas for the country? Is it food? Is it water? Is it climate? And then secondly, look for synergies with the different actors. Make sure that the national science foundations and national bodies are aligned with what can come from other donors, whether it's the EU as one of the biggest donors in science, whether it's from philanthropic organizations, and make sure you identify a number of really big chunks on which you work in the longer term together. And that kind of alignment or synergy, I think, can be exploited even much further. When we then add the private sector, you really have a powerhouse.
I will just again look at the challenges again for the African continent, the broader framework of the big challenges that we are going to face globally. If you look at climate change, for example, if you look at migration, which is happening because part of it of climate change. So if you look at all these big challenges facing us, globalization, all the rest of it, I would say that increasingly government will start to have to think of investment. And I keep on stressing of this investment, provide the social safety net, provide the investment in education, so that the population, the researchers, everybody will be better armed to face the challenges in the near and, of course, the longer term, the future. So it boils down again to the conversation, learn to put our hands in our pockets, align with what donors are giving, so that for every dollar the donor gives, we need to be able to top up or double or triple this amount. So again, align, put our investment, put our money where our mouth is. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, this ends the first opening plenary session of the Science Forum South Africa 2018. I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.